If I were to ask the question, what is the future of work? What pops into your mind? Do you start thinking about tech? Will AI change your work, or will it take over your job? Or does your brain go to human-centered thoughts? What will inclusive, purpose-driven work look like? And how will learning change? What if your job was to set the learning strategy for over 16,000 people at a globally recognized brand? Perhaps that might change your answer to my first question. Well, someone who has that challenge is Matt Simmons from Starbucks, and he joins me today to discuss this and more. So, Matt, welcome to In Good Company. Thank you for joining me today. How are you?
Really good. Thank you for having me.
Good. Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and we're excited to pick your brains on today's topic. So, first of all, before we get started, perhaps you could introduce yourself in 60 seconds.
Oh, right. In 60 seconds, I'll try.
Well, it's always the ask.
Cool. My name is Matt Simmons, and I have the pleasure of heading up learning and development for Starbucks UK.
Uh-huh.
Been in that position for it's about 6 years now.
Right.
Though I've been with Starbucks for 17 years,
Uh-huh.
so a fair length of time. Based in London, our office is in Chiswick in London. I'm a Londoner, born and bred. I live in North London with my wife and 2 daughters and 3 cats. Learning has really been my passion throughout my whole career. I think like many people in learning, I kind of stumbled into it through discovering a passion for it from working in operations.
Right.
Which is where I started my career.
Yeah.
And then found that actually the thing that really excited me was seeing people grow and develop, and the opportunity to build a career in that came up, and I took it.
Well, I have no doubt that you're the right person to speak to when it comes to talking about learning strategies. So let's get into that, if we may. We mentioned, obviously, that Starbucks is a globally recognised brand, and you're responsible for setting that learning and development strategy for the UK market. And that, I think, am I right? We would be correct in saying that that's supporting the learning needs for over 16,000 partners. Is that correct?
That's right.
A lot, significant amount of people. Where do you start? What are the sort of non-negotiable elements to include in your strategy?
Yeah, I mean, but part of both the pleasure and the pain of being part of a great global brand is that there are certain things which, of course, are non-negotiable.
Yeah.
For your market. So, you can't have, of course, a Starbucks that looks and feels like a completely different proposition to one that's in the US or France or wherever it might be. And to some extent, that does dictate, of course, large elements of your strategy.
Yeah.
And as I say, that's both a pleasure and a pain. So it does provide you with a lot of kind of guardrails and guidance already as to what you need to do. But what you then need to do, of course, is to make sure that it's locally relevant.
Yeah.
And so for us, it's really about taking what makes Starbucks and not distorting that or twisting it or turning it into something different, but just making sure that it lands in the right way for our partners here in the UK. And I would say a lot of our strategy is about that. So it's really, how do you translate what makes Starbucks great, into a way that makes sense for our partners in the UK. And so, part of that is around how you deliver that in a way that's relevant in the UK. So, I mean, just to give you one example of what I mean by that, at a global level, in the US, they don't have apprenticeship programs in the same way that we do here in the UK. So actually considering how we deliver our learning through our apprenticeship programs is something that is not going to be part of our global strategy, but is very much part of ours here locally. So things like that, of course, are a consideration. Then, of course, you've got issues around local compliance and legislation that you need to be really aware of. So that will then be another layer on top. I think the other thing for us as well is that a massive focus in the UK for not just myself but my colleagues in HR and operations that I work most closely with is how do we go about simplifying and making really accessible everything that we do to our partners here. And that's really been a key consideration of our strategy this year is how can we simplify absolutely everything we do. And we've made some good strides in that. There's still more work that needs to be done on that. I think that's probably work that's never done.
Yeah. And I would imagine through the process of doing the job that you do, you're not just delivering learning, but you're also learning yourselves. Is that in the process? That what would you say has been one of those key learnings from when you started doing the role that you do to now? What has there been any sort of pivotal moments in your experience?
So part of it actually is that thing I just mentioned about simplification.
Yeah.
I think earlier in my career, I would say not just me. I'm not alone in this, but I definitely had a tendency to overcomplicate,
Right.
or to maybe pitch things at the wrong level. And actually, I think there's real beauty in simplicity, and finding that sweet spot of not dumbing things down, but just making them really easy to grasp and accessible is that for me has been a really big learning, and just resisting the temptation to just layer on another thing. Oh, and just another thing, and just another thing, and just another thing,
Yeah.
and before you know it, you have this enormously complicated spaghetti of differing experiences that don't necessarily speak to each other or add up. So actually, sometimes stripping stuff away is I think the best thing that you can do.
Absolutely, it's in my as a sort of a relatable piece to that is in my other part of the role that I do at Impact is our video for marketing, and it's very much the same as an editing process. You could overcomplicate with all the sorts of editing tricks and whatever, but actually in many ways simplifying an edit to fit with a story makes so much more sense, and less is more in many ways. But to get to that is quite the art, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. I think so sometimes you just have to almost just get everything out there, but then stop and subtract and take stuff away.
Yeah. Somebody I follow put it nicely in that when you sort of work on projects like this, you're letting it breathe. So you kind of might strip it right back and then bring it back in a bit, and you sort of let the process breathe, which I thought was a really nice way of describing that process. So yeah,
I really like that too, and I think that probably links actually to another learning I'd highlight, which is that I think again earlier in my career I would think that you have to get everything right first time, and it has to emerge fully formed.
Yeah, feels like a lot of pressure.
It is, right, and of course things never work like that.
No.
and so actually not being afraid to iterate and to learn from the mistakes that you make,
absolutely,
and to have multiple versions of the same thing, and to be okay with that, I think is really important.
Yeah, definitely. Learning opportunities over mistakes often.
That's right, and I think we often talk about having learning organisations, and that's one of the holy grails when you work in development, is how do you have that. But I think that's in large part what a learning organisation is. It's just that has the mindset of not being afraid to do that and experiment and try stuff and fail.
Absolutely. I want to move on to AI, if I may. I don't think we've recorded a podcast recently that hasn't included it in some way, as it's well and truly upon us and is rapidly advancing every day. And I know that you're particularly interested in AI and the impact that can have on learning in whatever way that may take. So what advances are you seeing that are allowing organizations to leverage AI to enhance employee learning?
Yeah. So what I would say is that I think we're at that kind of gold rush stage in terms of AI development, in which there's an awful lot of kind of promises being made, not all of which necessarily kind of deliver great experiences. and I think, we do have to be very careful about what we use AI for and what
Yeah.
we don't use it for, and I think we need to all probably get a bit more thoughtful about that. So the stuff where I really do see it adding value is in the stuff that creates space for better thinking and removes routine, mundane, boring tasks that actually can be done better and quicker
Yeah.
by an AI, that really don't need human intervention. And in taking that off our plates, that creates space actually for learning, and for deeper thinking. And so that alone, I absolutely see creating learning opportunities, and that's the stuff that I think AI should be used for.
Mm.
I think I also see some really exciting applications for it in allowing people to practice stuff and to try things and experiment. So to give you one example, I saw a demo recently of a really very immersive and quite exciting coaching application.
Mm.
And I've seen a few of these actually, and they've not all been brilliant, but this particular one was really quite immersive,
Right.
and very lifelike, and it just allows you to practice in a very safe way, trying stuff out conversationally, seeing what lands, what doesn't, what words sound right coming out of your mouth, and
Yeah.
what things false. And I think that I really like, because we don't always get do-overs in life, and having the chance just to practice things first.
Yeah.
I really enjoy that. Yeah.
I found it really interesting in the coaching space. Not being an accredited coach myself, I don't feel fully qualified to be able to make too many comments here. But yeah, it feels like coaching process is interesting that you mentioned safe space there, and that provided a provider that they were looking at has the sort of making sure that data was locked down, and because I would imagine that in a coaching situation there could be disclosed some quite specific detail. Is that how you tested it, or was there?
So the application of this was slightly different in that when I say it's a coaching app, it was one that allows you to practice being the coach.
I see.
And the AI is playing the role
I
of
see.
coaching.
Yes.
Yeah, and so yes, that does limit those issues of confidentiality.
Yeah, sure.
It also, for me, that feels like an appropriate application for AI in that it's, as I say, it's allowing you to practice your skill as a coach. What it's not doing, and which I'm less of a fan of actually, is that it's not replacing what I think has to be a really personal human interaction with AI. Because that's one thing actually which does concern me a little bit, and that I do see happening in the world, and not just in the coaching space, but even in the counselling space. I think there are people that are using AIs now for the purposes of pursuing counselling, and that's, for me, is not what an AI should be used for. And I think the way our current AIs are designed, they can be a bit of an echo chamber. They will reflect back to you what they think you want to hear. They will just validate your choices, good or bad. And of course we call them AI, but they're not genuinely at this stage intelligent. They are not sentient, conscious beings, and they're not one that I think we should deposit our feelings, our dreams, our hopes in. So I mentioned that I think we need to be really thoughtful and careful about what we use AI for and what we don't, and that would be one of the distinctions I would draw.
I do think that that's a really key point of it's that ethical use and that and the mindset, which it's interesting to kind of hear people's perspectives of AI generationally as well. I think I've got two young kids that will be brought up in an AI world, whether they like it or not. I mean, I've got a 5-year-old and a 10-month-old, and so yeah, it'll be so interesting to see. I think there's the whole debate around, I suppose, potentially the risk of, laziness of thought. We won't be using sort of own ingenuity and own kind of thinking because we won't have to. The thinking is, in many ways that has happened already with, ever since the internet was around. We weren't going to books and encyclopedias anymore, were we? There was figuring things out, but at least there was still that sort of time difference of, not everything was so as accessible as it is now. So it's been really interesting to kind of see how, and also even in the past year or two, seeing how people's approaches to AI is already starting to change. And as you've just articulated, there's people are starting to now really think about how AI should and shouldn't be used, which I think is really interesting. So it's definitely bringing change, which I think will be different for all of us in some way. And I think we'll come back to sort of organizations will be the drivers, I think, of how it is used. What cultural shifts do you think, if any, that organizations need to make to successfully adapt to and adopt AI in a sort of a responsible and ethical way? Are you already sort of prepping for these at Starbucks?
Yeah, we are. I mean, early days, but yes, we are.
Yeah.
And I think one of those cultural shifts is just to be a lot more aware and thoughtful, as I say, about how we use AI and what we use it for. And I think we need to kind of start with first principles. And I think there's a massive education piece that all of us in learning need to support for the organisations that we work with, and we need to prepare, the people that we work with, in our organisations to do that. So, I mean, one of the ways that we're doing that at Starbucks actually is, and I mentioned earlier, apprenticeships. We're using our apprenticeship schemes to support that work. So we've just rolled out actually a data academy here in Starbucks UK, and that's offering various level of data-based apprenticeships in order to better equip our partners with the skills they need to understand data, because ultimately that's what AI as it currently stands is. It's a tool to help us to manipulate and understand vast amounts of data at speed. And we are actually next year then going to offer apprenticeships in AI. And we've had a number of partners ask us, well, I want to do an apprenticeship in AI now. It's like, but well, no, you need to understand the data first. What you're going to do with it before you then go on to develop your understanding of how to use AI. I almost see it as being like the building blocks that you need to put in place. And you start first with understanding of data and then move on to AI. I think there's a real danger of trying to run before you can walk, and then you end up, and we've seen so many examples of this, right? I mean, there have been many in the press of people not understanding AI and really, it having incredibly detrimental effects. And
definitely,
yeah.
It's so interesting that, because you're right. I think what AI isn't helping it, because it's advancing so fast and there's so much investment that's gone into it, that in order to advance it as fast as it is going, that we almost as humans aren't equipped to deal with that pace. We're not. It's almost just like we're not, unless you do that, for a living, and are at the forefront of it. Then it's hard to keep up with what AI advancements are doing. You only have to go offline for a couple of days to then, okay, this has now been released and it's totally disrupting everything you know about everything. It's just, and I think you're right. So AI is almost working too fast for us to kind of manage as human beings.
Well, absolutely right. And I think, we still have this human tendency to just kind of trust what it's telling us sometimes.
Yeah.
And you know, we know that, you know, AIs do experience hallucinations,
Yes.
and throw out data which is not always correct.
Yeah.
And you know, they're not doing that, of course, in any malicious way.
No.
They're pulling that from somewhere
Yeah.
within their data set.
Absolutely.
But again, that comes back to my point about understanding data first before you go on to try and use AI.
Yeah, it's so true. And I suppose in many respects that already happens. You know, and it has done for years. You know, we would, even if we would go to books, you know, some of the greatest minds in history didn't get everything right. You know, so what it's doing though again is because of, you know, not all it has to do is 9 times out of 10 get, you know, an impressive result or whatever it is that it's doing, and you do go to that point of where you start to trust things. I was having this conversation yesterday, as it goes, that it's almost going, and there's a famous scientist in the US that made this point. I forget his name, unfortunately, but it's almost going too far the other way, where we're now distrusting any things that we see, like even videos that we see, because so it'll almost go to a bit of The Boy Who Cried Wolf, where, you know, we end up, say we're watching a video of some event happening in the world, in the news or something, we'll start to get to the point, because AI is so capable of going, well, is this true? Is this legit? Or is it an AI generated? You know, so it's fascinating to kind of see, even in that respect, how things will be disrupted there. In terms of, I think you picked up on it a bit here, is that core human capability. That's kind of, and we at Impact have a strong view on what leadership is, and whatever new advances or trends that come along, we believe it's those core human capabilities that matter most. Based on what we've talked about, do you think that AI could even disrupt that, or do you think that AI has a place for even replicating some human behaviours?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and look, I strongly share your belief that yes, there are certain, you know, core human leadership qualities which persist throughout history, and I don't think that they are going to go away. You know, I do think that they will continue to be just as important, maybe even more so. And I don't think that AI can or will replace those. I think, if anything, actually, and you know, I think anyone would be foolish to try and make predictions at the moment about where this might go. But if I had to make a prediction, I think that we're likely to see a little bit of a rebound in a few years from from a demand for AI generated experiences and tools to the opposite, to more human. To things that value the power of connection and genuineness and human experiences. And I think that will very much apply in the leadership space.
I agree. I mean, our very first episode of this podcast, we interviewed one of the key people responsible for developing our leadership model, and he phrased it that leadership is innately human. And I mean, speaking of learning, I've done a lot of learning over these past 50 odd episodes that we've had of this podcast, and speaking to so many people about various different things, and I think that's always stayed with me as one of the, because I think, I mean, we at Impact believe that leadership should come from anywhere within an organisation, not just people in a leadership role potentially, specifically. Sorry, and I think that there is that. It's part of it is meaning, and that's something that you brought up. But AI doesn't have that meaning necessarily, or the purpose. It's not. It hasn't got that yet. And I use the word "yet" because you never know, as you've said, with what's going to come around the corner. And I just sort of reassuring to hear that even you think also that we might find this sort of circular thing that might happen where we'll come back to those key things about that, learning to be human again almost is going to be, well, hopefully will continue to be it's that fundamental, isn't it, of leadership, that it is a human role essentially.
Absolutely. I think my fear in that space, and actually this goes probably across the board, is that at worst we could end up with a two-tier system whereby we have kind of mass-produced AI products that are not necessarily engaging or human, unique, that are just okay and maybe just about do the job. And then we have more expensive human bespoke leadership development courses, for example, or it could be anything else, right? I mean, this we're seeing AI being used to create music now, we could see the same happen, I think, in many different spheres of life, and I think that would be really dangerous.
Yeah, and we haven't even gone down to the sort of the sort of the sustainability of AI, and the amount of resource that it takes to run the data centers. I mean, and the massive, huge data centers that are being built to sort of meet the demands of AI use. It's that's a whole other conversation, I think, that we could get into.
I mean, you're absolutely right, but again, I think that those are the kind of things that we do need to be thinking about.
Well, it's true.
And it is terrifying. I mean, I was recently playing around with some AI image generating software, and then afterwards I did some research and found out that every time I'd generated one of those pictures, it was using as much electricity as charging my smartphone from 0 to 100, and I felt incredibly guilty for all of the energy that I just used. So it's a really, really valid point.
And I think, just to sort of bring it home on the AI conversation, I think that there's a space for AI, and that it can do amazing things. And if it helps, in medicine, for example, if it helps come up with cures for cancers, and there's going to be so much that it can enable. But I think we're at a stage at it where we're still learning a lot about it, and of course we learn things at a much different rate to allegedly what the computers learn. So yes, it's super fascinating. I could talk about it for a long time, but I do want to move on from talking about AI to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We've talked about DEIB in a number of podcasts before, and so I wanted to speak to you about it as well. We've talked about the sheer number of partners that you look after in Starbucks UK, and what the future of leadership might look like. But how can we leverage the diversity and inclusion of organisations to enhance a learning and leadership culture?
Yeah. So I mean, I think, look, it's a question which every large organisation asks itself, I think, and generally will respond with a number of programmes, which sometimes are successful. I think there's been some really great programs focused on DE&I out there. There's also been others which can feel a bit tokenistic, right? And I think that's what we would all want to avoid. So I think programs that generate actual outcomes are the ones we need to be going after, and the ones we need to be valuing. I think within Starbucks, one that I've really appreciated in the last couple of years was our Next Generation Leadership Program,
right?
Which was, as the name suggests, was looking to equip future leaders, younger leaders, those
Yeah.
under the age of 30,
Yeah.
often from different backgrounds than the usual leadership profile,
Yeah.
with the skills needed to step into more elevated roles, and that's been a real success. So,
Great.
I think programs like that excite me, or even more fundamentally, just where we build an organisation that genuinely values difference and diversity of thinking. I
Right.
think I think that's the shift that we need to make, and that we all need to move to. In that, we often talk about diversity as just being something that is visible and
Yeah.
obvious, but it's not. Actually, the real strength that comes from diversity and different backgrounds is that it brings a different way of seeing things, a different way of looking at the world,
Yeah.
and it's that organisations should want, right?
Yeah.
And should want to be challenged actually on the way that we do things, because often the way that organisations can do things can be very monocultural. So I think the shift that organisations need to make is to listen more and to be more open to challenge and to different voices,
Yeah.
and to have programs that encourage that.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier, a big part of my learning has been having the opportunity to speak to a number of different people in various different topics, and one of them was all around, in terms of the neurodivergence of people and getting and going into the belonging piece, and as you say, it's not something that's just visible. It's not in every circumstance, and having that diversity of thought and approach, and the way, as you said, the way of seeing the world, and it is possibly one of the most valuable things that an organization can utilize and encourage, because it ultimately, with part of that, brings a much stronger culture. I would argue. Would that be fair to say?
Spot on. And I think enabling that does take a bit of a shift of leadership mindset.
Yeah.
And it requires a shift from a more traditional top-down command and control style of leadership to one that is more inclusive, and open to diversity of thinking, and an understanding that leadership might not have all of the answers actually, and that somebody out there in the organisation, and you mentioned this earlier, right, that leadership actually doesn't just belong at a leadership level organisationally, it belongs to everybody, and you can see great examples across the organisation. But similarly, great thinking, great thoughts might well, for us, it might be one of our baristas actually. In Aberdeen or Sheffield.
Absolutely.
That has a brainwave rather than a member of the leadership team sat here in the office.
Absolutely, and I think that's it. Is that and we've kind of talked about the human-centered approach, and a true, leadership, as we've talked, can be seen as an action rather than a person. And so, as you mentioned, somebody from a branch, one of the baristas, might have an incredible idea, and if there's the platform, if there's the forum in which they can express their ideas, and have that shows leadership, human-centered leadership across the organization, where it's allowing people from no matter where they are in the business to go, I've had an idea, have you ever considered this, and creating that space has got to be so valuable, and probably should and could be encouraged in a lot more organizations also, I would argue. So it sounds like Starbucks is already well on that way, which is great to hear.
I mean, I think that we are. I'm not going to claim that we're perfect.
Of course, yeah. We're all human, after all.
Absolutely. There are ways in which we still need to improve in that space. But
Yeah,
we do have a number of core values at Starbucks, as many organisations will do.
yeah,
But one of ours that is particularly core for us is belonging.
yeah, yeah,
That's one of our 5 core values.
yeah,
And that's something which I think is central to all of our partners'
yeah.
experience. That sense that we do belong to something
Absolutely.
bigger, and when we do have a say in it.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned earlier about the next generation leadership program. I'm curious that in terms of moving the needle on inclusion and belonging at scale, would you say that is the most impactful initiative, or is there anything else that either Starbucks or maybe you've seen outside of Starbucks that you think might be, or have you seen sort of a successful initiative being run in an organisation?
Yeah. So I mean, I think as well as things like that, which are all about growing talent, I think you also need to ensure equity and equality. So actually, I think pay equality is a really big thing.
Yeah.
And that's something that we've put a lot of work into to kind of tracking and driving over the last few years. And so, in terms of what I've seen other organisations do, I mean, I would call out IKEA actually for the work that they've done in that space.
Yeah.
And I know they started focusing on that 20 odd years ago. And that through hard work,
yeah,
and deliberate focus, they have got to a place where they have achieved pay equality. And I think there's not many organisations that can say that. So I definitely admire the work that they've done in that space.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And would you say that pay equality contributes a lot to that feeling of inclusion and belonging, or would you say that's, or is it as simple as just a perk?
No, I think it is fundamental because money for all of us is an emotive topic.
Of course, yeah.
Money is more than just money. It's and we all use money, rightly or wrongly, as the yardstick by which we feel valued, and it has an emotional attachment for us. So when we look around and maybe see or feel that we're not being paid fairly, and that somebody is getting more for doing the same work than we are, that absolutely has a massive impact on how we feel about the organisation, about the work that we do, about ourselves. So I do see that as being really, really fundamental.
Yeah, a great answer. And we have come to the end of my questions, apart from one, but I just wanted to thank you for the past nearly 40 minutes. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I thank you. I've been fascinated, and I could talk a lot more, particularly about the AI space. I find it fascinating and intriguing and terrifying all at the same time. But before I let you go, I'm going to ask you our final question, which we ask all of our guests on this podcast, which is, if you were to take a moment to reflect on your career, and you had the opportunity to speak to your younger self, fresh-eyed and ready to embark on your career, what would be the best piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
Okay, so this will sound a bit weird, but I'm just
I'm ready for it. I'm here for
it. So to not care so much.
Okay, great. Yeah,
and what I mean by that is not to care less about the work that you do and about yourself, but to care less about what others think.
Sure.
And to care less about making mistakes and looking foolish.
Yeah.
And to be, I wish I could have been more comfortable with being myself, with just trying stuff out, with not being so worried about what you might think. And I think above all else, it would be that. Yeah.
Well, I think first of all, I appreciate your honesty there, because I know what you were meaning when you said to not care as much, and I think you're right. There are times where you do just need to get on with it and go, if it doesn't go the way we intended, that's okay, and we can learn from that. So I think that that's a great piece of advice, and I sort of throw it back to you. Would you say that you live by that advice now?
Oh, wow, that's not always. No,
Yeah.
no.
Isn't it funny how?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, that's that's a really good question. So more than I used to, yes,
yeah,
but it still takes a conscious effort, you know, and I have to remind myself of it, and
yeah.
I still don't always achieve that.
And there's nothing wrong with that either. Having an awareness of it is sort of the first step, isn't it? So yeah, maybe as of after this recording, that'll be the pivotal moment, and you'll go, whatever. Yeah. Right, Matt. Thank you ever so much. I'm gonna let you get back to your day. But it's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you giving us your time today. So thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, it's been great, and I look forward to when we can speak again.
Lovely. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, that just leaves me to say, if you would like to learn any more about what Impact does, or of course, if you'd like to connect with either of myself or Matt on LinkedIn, then you'll find all of the links that you need from today's episode in the description of where you found us today. So that remains me to thank Matt one more time for joining me today. Thank you, Matt. And until the next time, take care.
Hey, you're on my mind, you know.